I'm Scott Starker. My course is called How to Interpret the Bible. This is the video number 2, and it is called Determine the Meaning. In the previous video, I talked about the JEDP theory. Basically, there is no agreement among the JEDP scholars of which of the JEDP authors wrote which part, so there is no reason to change the evangelical system. The JEDP theory is only one school. The second school I want to talk about is the author, text, and reader controversy. I'm mostly using parts of the book from Dr. Robert Stein, Playing by the Rules. The typical Bible study, according to Mark 1:1-15, I'll hand out right now. But first, here is the script of a typical Bible study illustrating the way it is frequently done. What questions, issues does this raise about hermeneutics, in other words, interpreting the Bible? Does a passage of the Bible mean many things? Can a passage mean different and even contradictory things? Are there any controls over the meaning of the passage? Is interpretation controlled by means of individual revelation given by the Holy Spirit? Do the words and grammar control the meaning of the text? Which text? KJV, ESV, NASB, NIV, RSV, New Living Bible, etc. Or Hebrew and Greek, which better reflects the original authors? Introduction to author, text, and reader. All communication involves 3 distinct and essential components: the author, the text, and the reader. I know that the reader's intended meaning are the control over the text. The passages in the Bible can only mean one thing. The author controls the meaning of all of the text. As strange as it sounds, one of the main goals of interpreting the Bible is to discover the intended meaning of the text being studied. There is a major issue in some circles, though. Where does the meaning originate? The author, reader, or text? The answer to these questions and others help us to form an interpretive framework. That is, a hermeneutical theory. A hermeneutical theory allows us to correctly understand and apply what we find in the Bible. I know that the meaning of the text is controlled by the author, but what are the other 2 options? The text determines the meaning. It's popular among literary critics. Some say the meaning is a property of the text. They say that the meaning of the text is completely independent of what the author meant or intended at the time was written, what the author was thinking about or wanting to convey is totally irrelevant to the meaning of the text. Once it is written, a text takes on a life of its own. If the Apostle Paul himself were to appear before us and say, "What I meant to say when I was writing this passage was," the people who say that the text determines its meaning would reply, "That's very interesting, but quite irrelevant." What Paul would say about the meaning of the text that he wrote is no more important or authoritative than what any other person's interpretation. Another example comes from the Supreme Court. Supreme Court Justice William J. Brennan, who lived from 1906 to 1997, said in the 1980s, "The desire to follow the original intent of the Constitution is arrogance cloaked in humility. It is arrogant to pretend that from our vantage point we can gauge accurately the intent of the framers. Too specific, contemporary questions." This is scary because it is a Supreme Court justice who believes in the text controlling the meaning and not the author. 39 men signed, in other words, authored the Constitution, including George Washington and Benjamin Franklin, in September 17th, 1787. What are the problems with this statement? The author's intended meaning says, the text can only convey meaning. The text cannot possess it. The meaning of the text is only a construction of thought. The text cannot think, so the belief that the text controls the meaning cannot be true. The reader determines the meaning. This approach theorizes that the person who reads the text gives it its meaning. As each person reads a text, he or she creates his or her own meaning. If people came up with different meanings, it would be impossible to decide which one is true because the text permits multiple meanings. Each meaning belongs to different communities. So you end up with the Marxist interpretation, the feminist interpretation, the evangelical interpretation, the blank, etc., which are equally legitimate meanings in each of the communities. Each interpretation contributes his or her own meaning to the text. Well, my high school teacher, English teacher, Miss Severson, had us write a paper on an article. I would say my paper was a good one because I thought that the author controls the meaning. And Miss Severson had the opposite view. She gave the best grade to a fellow classmate who had nothing to say about the author's intended meaning. That gal had a similar situation in her own life and wrote about her experience without saying anything about the author's meaning. The author's intended meaning says, why are there multiple meanings of the exact same act? Author's intended meaning has only one meaning. There is no critical apparatus for dialogue between communities. In other words, the Marxist and the feminist interpretation, etc. The author determines the meaning. A lot of us say that the intended meaning of a text is controlled by the author. The meaning is what the author intended it to mean. For example, if Paul were alive, he could tell us what he wrote he meant. The author's intended meaning is the common sense approach we use in normal communication. To argue against this view, whether you argue that the text is controlled by the text, or if the text is controlled by the reader, you have to agree that in normal conversation, the text is controlled by the author. Whenever scholars write arguing for the text or the reader controlled the intended meaning, they were writing the text for the reader, but the intended meaning is controlled by him or herself. In other words, the author. The author, text, or reader. Which of these three determines the meaning? It is not a question of whether these other three meanings are possible, but that are unavoidable problems that cannot be avoided by denying each. The question is, which is to have priority? What should we strive for? I know that the author's intended meaning is not only possible to determine, but it is crucial and should be our goal. We even have an ethical obligation to the authors to do so. Objections to the author and responses to determine the meaning. Objection: the intentional fallacy. It is impossible for us to get into the mind of an author. So they say. One cannot relive the experiences of the author. The author's innermost emotions, feelings, and motives are simply not accessible to the reader. Therefore, the meaning willed by the author is inaccessible. The response. The reader's goal is not to experience or replicate or reduplicate the mental and emotional experiences of the author when the author wrote. The goal is to understand what the author consciously sought to communicate to his readers by what he wrote. The meanings are two different things. They are, one, the personal psychological experience, and number two, an external attempt to communicate ideas. Another objection. The author may have been linguistically incompetent. A recognition that everyone at one time or another fails to adequately express what one intends to communicate. Response. Although this is always possible, the thought of potential failure doesn't keep us from trying. We don't give up in frustration without even trying. It takes work to find the author's intended meaning, but it's worth it. Also, the fact that we believe in the Bible was divinely inspired comes into play at this point. We believe that God gave the authors a divine competence which enabled them to express final truth adequately. Another objection. A modern reader cannot understand the intent, meaning of ancient authors. There is a radical difference between our two cultures and situations. In other words, our worldview. We deal with the gigabytes, megahertz, computers, airplanes, televisions, microwaves, artificial hearts, space travel, nuclear power, etc. They dealt with sandals, togas, animal sacrifices, etc. Response. These differences should not be minimized. Too often we do not take this into consideration enough. However, we share in common humanity. We have all been created in the image of God, and we have same basic functions. Although the cultural differences are significant, overcoming them is surely difficult, but not impossible. Another objection. How can we understand the biblical writers when they wrote about their own individual faith experience? Response. This confuses what the authors mean by the words he or she used with the understanding of the subject matter he wrote or she wrote about. We can understand what is written without being able to relate to the context. Final objection. Can we rely on an interpretive system that requires interpreters to reach into history and act as a semi-professional historian? We do not have to have historians to find out what the author's intended meaning is. Response, the last one. The opposite is true. Every interpreter is automatic historian to interpret the original authors. The role of the author. In order for a text to exist, someone, sometime, and somewhere decided to write the text and to have others read it for the purpose of conveying something meaningful. What a text meant when it was written can never change, no more change than any historical event can change. However, that raises the question of whether a text could have implications of which the author was not necessarily aware. For example, Ephesians 5:18, it says, "And do not get drunk with wine, for that is debauchery, but be filled with the Spirit." Back then the word wine equals 3 parts water and 1 part wine. Now, in our current situation, could it mean beer, whiskey, rum, vodka, or champagne, or all of these? If we were to ask Paul, he would state that although he was not consciously thinking of these other alcoholic products, he meant for Christians to not become drunk by using them as well. Paul's text has implications which go beyond his own particular conscious meaning at the time. But these implications do not conflict with the original intended meaning. Those things are included in the principle which Paul wished to communicate. Does Paul mean getting stoned on marijuana or getting high on cocaine? Yes, if we understand Paul wrote as a principle with other implications. So Paul seeks to communicate, in other words, implicates, do not take into your body substances which cause you to lose control of your senses and inhibit and natural inhibitions. The purpose of biblical interpretation involves not just understanding the specific conscious meaning of the author, but also to understand the principle or pattern of meaning which he sought to communicate. This statement becomes more specifically, starting with the author's intended meaning leads to implications, lead to principle, and lead to significance or application. The problem of meaning. If you are really struggling to decide which one has control of the meaning in nonfiction, watch my next detailed video called The Problem of Meaning. Be warned, this video is a little over 4 pages long, but the Problem of Meaning video is 23 pages long. Whew. But if you have decided that the meaning is controlled by the author, skip the Problem of Meaning video and go to the Process of Interpretation video.